perspectives, I suppose. We started off with my colleague, Yet Stellenbosch, Professor Thuli Madutsala, the former public protector. We had Adam Habib, Professor Adam Habib, who is now at SOAS at the University of London as its director. And we recently also, I had the privilege of interviewing the Archbishop of Cape Town, Thabo Makgoba, and what an incredible experience all three of those occasions were. Today, we interview somebody who certainly needs no introduction, a mother, an activist, a vice chancellor, a doctor, a senior executive at the World Bank, a politician, a businesswoman, an author, a hero to many of us, and somebody who holds more honorary doctorates than some of us have ordinary degrees, and doctorates from, you know, some of the world's renowned universities. I'll just mention 5 of them, among many others: Princeton, Yale, Harvard, Cambridge, and the University of the Free State. So, you know, we have an illustrious set of institutions. Dr. Ramphele, what an honor to talk with you today. And I was just reminded, as I prepared for today, you were once detained under the Terrorism Act and banned to Zanin between 1977 and 1983. And you were one of the people that helped me as a young man growing up understand and indeed commit to, at those days, the philosophy of Black consciousness. So for all those reasons, I welcome you, ma'am, to this event. In mentioning all your, thank you, in mentioning all your roles that you've played, did I leave anything out?
No, that's more than enough to mention. I think we are here to talk to people about leadership, not about a person.
Can I jump right into it? You've written several books, and I've tried to read all of them in preparation for today. Some of them, of course, I've encountered before. A lot of it has to do with the state of leadership in the country today. As you look at the pandemic that's engulfing us, the fact that we're behind schedule with the rollout of the vaccines, let alone the purchasing of the vaccines. Countries like India, as you know, have already disseminated vaccines, both in the region but across the world, etc. What is your sense of pandemic leadership in South Africa today?
I believe any leader who wants to leave a mark and to make a difference in the world has to start at the beginning. And this comes from ancient African wisdom. Know thyself. You cannot lead others if you don't know who you are, what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, and therefore be ready in times of crisis or times of opportunity to draw on your strengths and to manage down your weaknesses. And so when I look at my beautiful country, I cannot but weep, because here we are 27 years after we entered what was supposed to be a period of uhuru, of prosperity for all, of well-being for all, of building and creating healthy ecosystems. We have failed because our leaders did not heed that ancient wisdom. Know thyself. When you look at the pandemic today, for example, we have leaders standing up without any hint of irony and saying to Mr. and Mrs. South Africa, the way we should deal with the pandemic is to social distance, to wash our hands for 20 seconds in running water. It's like they don't know the country they are leading. So our inabilities to take advantage of the wonderful resources of this country stem from this failure to have the humility to spend time traveling inwards and really facing your demons, facing those things that may trip you up, and then also celebrating those things that are big strengths that can help you do the things that sometimes look impossible. And so coming back to the pandemic, South Africa is endowed, and you and I as former vice chancellors know that, we've got a very strong, deep science and technology capabilities in this country.
Yep.
We have built institutions such as the CSIR. We have built the wonderful entities across the spectrum. And when you look at the quality of graduates we are producing from almost all of our universities today, in one area or the other, are people who are ready to lead. But what if you are being led by people who don't know themselves? They are unlikely to know their country. They are unlikely to know the strengths of their country. They are unlikely to play to those strengths. And they are unlikely to acknowledge the weaknesses, because we've got to acknowledge them, because otherwise they become real ghosts that trip us. And so we failed when the first case was recorded a year ago. We should have immediately called all of the heads of our science and technology and other areas, including, this is another blessing we have, a very strong, high-performing private health sector. And look at what the United States does. I mean, it's not a great example in the past administration, but when they face the crisis, they can say to the military, look, you are now going to be part and parcel of dealing with this crisis. So all the logistical capabilities, the crisis management capabilities get harvested, put in one place. And it's not about politicians wanting to be seen and speaking about things they know nothing about. It is the time for politicians to lead from behind and to make sure that we understand the nature of the crisis, we understand what we can bring to that crisis from our strengths, and we get going. There's no reason why we had to go and buy vaccines from India. It's a disgrace. We built at great cost BioVac, which is standing there and has not produced a single vaccine as far as I know. But guess what? In a crisis like this, part of the disaster management process should have been to say, let's see which institutions we can boost to do what, and who should we be asking to come and do. The other thing we have, which we haven't harvested, the diaspora, the South African diaspora is far and wide in the world. And I'm sure many of them would have been proud to be part and parcel of a process of managing this disruptive and completely unprecedented challenge that we're facing. And so I believe that the mistakes we made in managing the COVID crisis stemmed from our failure to know ourselves, to know our strengths, to know our weaknesses, and to be honest with one another in having conversations about whatever problem we face and harvest all the wisdom so we can work together. And that's what leadership is about.
I like that point very much. Can I test an idea with you? You might recall that during the days, certainly of the UDF, you would often hear the comrades talking about the problem of immediatism. In other words, you just deal with your immediate problem and you try and solve it there and then, as opposed to looking at the long-term, health or the long-term political strategy in that context. And I just wonder very often, whether the ESCOM debacle is a problem of there was nobody saying 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now, what will the energy needs be of a country with 50 million people? In March, February, March, when we become aware of the problem of COVID, everybody was sort of trying to just deal, as you said, with the hand washing method. There wasn't people sort of saying, we're going to need to deal with the vaccine problem very quickly here, because, at some point, and I wonder if our tendency to focus on now, puts us at a disadvantage with countries that do long-term planning, whether it's electricity or vaccine. What are your thoughts on that, Prof?
I think you have really put your finger on it. Long-term planning comes out of confidence in the self, again, goes back to knowing who you are, and confidence in the future of your country, and taking ownership for whatever it is that you are wishing for, and being willing to put in the effort. So if you go back to the UDF time, and this, I think, is the fatal flaw in the foundations of our democracy. That we fought for this freedom on the basis of opposing a system. Whereas the era you're talking about, when we, the great little unwashed students, we were thinking about the future. When we focused on who are we and what makes it possible that a small minority can oppress such a large majority, and that majority is cowering under the fear of this little minority. And the minute we got to know ourselves, we got to understand the power we had to shape the future we wanted. The day we named ourselves and not allowed the nonsense of non-European, non-white to define us, we were free. And when you are free, your horizon goes much further. And so the most important victory for the apartheid government was in decimating the Black consciousness movement. After they killed Steve, then they killed the organizations that we had formed. And then people went back into an anti-apartheid struggle instead of continuing the liberation struggle. You see, when you're fighting for freedom, you have to define what it looks like to you. Not in terms of what you don't want to have, but what you want to have. And you start thinking about, so what investments should we be making for the future? Which is why I was one of those opposed to the idea of freedom now, education tomorrow. Look at the cost of that, right? And we also, after 1994, did not take the time to pause. There were people like you who were experts in education. There were people like, no. We brought in education via those who were in exile, models that had failed, even in the most highly sophisticated countries. But because we were anti anything that was here, we thought by borrowing from outside would be better. Again, you see, when you don't know yourself, you don't trust yourself, you don't celebrate what you have, you end up with a problem. And so the short-termism comes out of the failure to appreciate what it means to be a free citizen. What are your rights? What are your responsibilities? We have a beautiful constitution. It was just written for the sake of the negotiations, put aside. Many of the people in parliament, in government, haven't read it. They don't know what's in there, right? And we even had a president who said, "Into Yabalungu." So when you have that mindset of not taking ownership of your country, of the systems you want to build, but also going back to the issue of taking ownership and playing to your strengths. One of the problems of our country, and this is why India is different from us in a number of ways, we measure our success by what the UK says, what the World Bank says. And so in post-1994, we did very little to build our education systems as an African education system. We did very little to revisit our history. Our kids, for many years after 1994, were still learning about Jan van Riebeeck arriving here. I mean, really, really now. And you look at the quality of language teaching and development. We've killed the African languages in this country because this is a measure, supposed to be a measure of success, that your child speaks English and can't speak Xhosa or Pedi. I mean, so again, back to Lando, know yourself. Imagine if we just knew that this continent is not just the cradle of humanity, but is the cradle of civilization. Of course, we suffered from the Greeks stealing, plagiarizing and stealing our wisdom. It's now called Greek philosophy. No, it's African philosophy. It's called mathematics, Pythagoras. He was taught here by Egyptian priests. But we don't know ourselves. Very little African history is taught in our schools, even in our universities. And so I would say, Jonathan, until South Africa re-anchors itself as an African country, not for purposes of populism, but for spiritual, intellectual, emotional reasons, so we can make peace with who we are. You know, why are we wearing Gucci's when in fact, I mean, African cloths and you know, patterns are so beautiful, and they cost a fraction of Gucci. But because we are still mentally colonized, that's our measure of success. So long-term thinking that the Chinese are doing and the Indians, when they have a good government, are doing, is all about faith in yourself, self-confidence, self-respect, respect for people who look like you, respect for your country, your culture, and therefore hope and a responsibility to make sure that future generations don't inherit a wasteland. How else would we have state capture if we had had people with a mindset that says there is a future? But no, it's now, it's me, myself, and I, and my friends.
In one of your books, Conversations with My Sons and Daughters, a beautiful, beautiful writing. I mean, one of the questions that comes up there is where did we lose our idealism? You know, and you're speaking to the youth. Where did we lose our idealism? Because I'll be honest with you, you know, certainly my generation, you believed in the liberation movements. You know, you really thought, oh my goodness, there's, you know, and to be honest, as I said the other day, you know, they were amazing people. People like Oliver Tambo was a really deeply religious person, apart from being a fighter. You know, people of the caliber of Dulcie September was assassinated as the ANC's rep. And you know, when I first left the country, I mean, I met people from BCM, from, you know, the PAC and so on, who were really, really outstanding intellectuals, you know. So you understood this idea that you became idealistic, you really believed it. The next thing you know, we're stealing PPE equipment from people who are at death's door. We're stealing from the primary school nutrition program. We're stealing. How did we lose our idealism, Prof?
I believe that the first mistake we made in 1994 was to ascribe our freedom to the so-called liberators. So we became passive recipients of freedom. Now, I wasn't liberated by anybody. I put in my bits. And I know many ordinary Mr. and Mrs. Kumalo who put in their bit. But they were made into supplicants. And we all were complicit in it. The fact that Oliver Tambo spent so many years in exile, we had every reason to thank him, respect him. The same thing with those who came from jail, those who came from exile. But that's no reason to give them a blank check. I mean, I grew up as a kid. I didn't know the liberation movement until I got to medical school. But one of the things we learned at medical school as activists was how terrible some of the experiences of people were in exile. So to romanticize exile and to ascribe everything that is good to one liberation movement or another is where we lost our idealism. Because when you say other people liberated you, you give up your agency as a historical agent. Now, one thing I have never done is to give up my agency. Nothing, no money, no position will ever convince me to do that, because then I would have died inside. And so if we want to rediscover our idealism, we must go back to that injunction of our ancients: know thyself. Look at our beautiful young people in the streets of Johannesburg or Cape Town or wherever. Yes, they have an absolute strong case about the funding of education. But what's the reason to burn tires? If you are a real owner of this country, would you really take out bricks from the pavement if it's your country and you are the owner? Would you really burn something? Would you destroy something? The owner? You see, the other problem about not having taken ownership of this country is what has made us lose our idealism. Because then now Imali kahulumende, is government this, is government the other thing, is government the other thing. You are just a thing, a recipient of government largesse. And when it doesn't come, you get angry. You are like a child. I didn't get my supper, so I'm going to break my place. I didn't get this, so I'm going to break the windows of my house. This is it's a fundamental and an existential problem. Now, we live in a country on a continent which is meant to be the place where people come to get the hot coals of Ubuntu. What does it mean to be human? Human beingness was explored and refined here. And if we were to simply turn back to that, not back in history, in time, but spiritually, emotionally, and mentally. Because to tell you the honest truth, Jonathan, when I hear my president saying, we have an unhealthy relationship with alcohol, really now? Why? If I'm a leader and I come home and I see my children have got an unhealthy relationship to food, I should ask, what has happened? The unhealthy relationship with alcohol, with drugs, with ourselves, because we kill ourselves and those close to us, is a cry for healing. Healing that broken self that doesn't know whom it is. And unless we pay attention to that, it is very difficult to be able to address issues in an orderly way, in a way that solves today's problem and prepare the pathway for 5, 10, 20 years from now. And I believe our young people have the capacity to do that, because those young people I've had the privilege of meeting and talking to, who are telling me about this and the government doesn't do the fees. Hold on, whose country is this? And how have you, or would you and your peers want to see a difference? Where have you articulated this? Not this thing of when I'm angry, then that's when we hear them. That's when they're wearing their ANC t-shirts and their EFF t-shirts. Really now? So I think we have an obligation. My generation has a lot to answer for, because delivering 1994 was meant to be the first step. We were just at the door. Then we should have spent time figuring out what kind of house, what renovations do we need, what is this the right roof, and how do we agree on how we govern ourselves, not in terms of law and order or just the constitution that we put at the table. How do we govern ourselves? And I think, Jonathan, if we were to, all of us, we don't have to spend hours in the constitution, just making true that slogan that we mouth, Ubuntu, and making it a real guiding North Star in all of our lives. There's no state capture that would happen. There is no gender-based violence that would happen. All of those things will be managed by you hold yourself and say, I can't do that.
I cannot, thank you for going in the direction of the current crisis around student debt and all of that, because I can't not ask you as a Vice Chancellor of one of our premier universities what would you have done, Prof, in the current situation? On the one hand, you know, a lot of the students just can't afford to pay off that debt tomorrow morning, you know, in order to register. As I've said often on the radio this week, last week, you can't get water out of a stone, you know, if you don't have money. On the other hand, as you know, as a vice chancellor, we run tight ships. It's not like you have money that you can just suddenly take, and especially when the funding of institutions have declined in real terms over many years. If you're in leadership, either in a university or within government, how would you resolve this almost chronic, you know, constant, every January, every February, every March, student protest around access and debt? I'm very curious how you would manage something like that.
You know, Jonathan, I came from a village and my father died when I was doing pre-medical courses at the University of the North. When I got to medical school, in fact, let's go back to the University of the North, which was one of those bush colleges at the time. I had no money. My mother was a young widow. So instead, the university called me and said, do you know that there is something called a student loan fund that fully covers your boarding, your lodging, your books? I said, no. Okay. So I signed. Now, this is the apartheid government. And fortunately for me, when they saw my results, they decided, no, you don't need a loan. So they gave me a full bursary. When I got to medical school, same thing. I had no money. I had to borrow money to get onto the train to get to Durban. And so they register me, they make me sign the student loan fund, which the apartheid government made sure every child who registered had full coverage with a loan bursary scheme that when you finish school, you have a choice of working for government, in which case after 3 years is written off. And if you don't want to work for government anyway, I think up to 2/3 was written off if you had passed and you were graduating. So the third you then have to pay off. Now, we go back to that question of planning. When we took over government in 1994, what were we thinking? How did we think when we say the doors of learning shall be open? They don't get open because you have a key. There's something called funding, right? So again, there was no thinking, no planning. People were ready to occupy spaces so that they can have the jobs where they don't even pay 75 rand rent that they owe to the Department of Public Works. That's the mentality. So the problem is that we didn't plan. Now you are asking me, what would I have done today? I think all the vice chancellors should come together, insist on seeing not just the Minister of Education, but the Minister of Finance, the President, and the Minister of Higher Education in one room. This is a national crisis, which has been brewing for 27 years and is very easily resolvable. You know, one of the things that COVID has shown the world that says you can't do deficit financing. Look at what the US, they just print money. You are a sovereign, excuse me, right? And one of the duties of a sovereign is to be able to create the flow of funding to cover the investments it needs to make. This is not a cost, this is an investment, right? Now, quite frankly, if you calculate how much it is compared to the arms deal that they made they signed up for in no time at all. This is easily dealt with. It only needs a long-term view, love of country, knowledge of self, knowledge of the strengths of your country, and a commitment to leave for future generations a legacy that they will be proud of, you will be proud of. When you go to your maker and your ancestors, you say, this is the little bit I did.
Prof, you know, we will shortly be going into, I see there's a lot of good questions in the chat room for you from our audience, but I still want to just get through 2 or 3 questions. I normally start here, but I want to move towards a finish here. You're born in 47 in rural Limpopo, and you become one of the most powerful and influential women on this continent and indeed in the world. When you reflect back on your journey, when so many things could have gone wrong, you know, a lot of people will want to know, a lot of young people would want to know, how do you explain your success as a leader, your emergence and success as a leader?
Well, I can only thank my father, who I was the tiniest child. There were 7 of us. And I didn't have any capacity to ride a bike or do any of those things. And he was my teacher and principal. He said, you have a brain, you use it, and don't compete with anybody except yourself. So he wasn't happy, I'm number 1, so what? And you show me 70-something, 80-something%, what's happened to the other? So my father was a very important influence in my life in terms of leadership, because what he was doing is, you've got a strength, don't worry about not being able to run, not focus on what you can do and use that to the maximum to praise your God and to create something for the future. And then I had the fortune of having a very strong mother. And who never allowed any kind of patriarchal dominance over her. It wasn't done. And I had a very strong grandmother, in fact, strong grandmothers on both sides. So the feminine that I got to know was very strong. All the women in my life were powerful women in their own rights. They were traditional women, but very powerful. And then, of course, I had the good fortune of going to medical school and meeting with a generation that changed the way the country called South Africa thought about life. It's a tragedy that those who were in exile sought to deny the value of this Black consciousness. And they are the poorer for it. Now, once you liberate yourself and you come to that deep self-respect and respect for anybody who looks like you, and respect for anything that is about you, your culture, your heritage, I tell you, Jonathan, there's nothing to stop you. The police, you remember the security police of that time were big Afrikaner boers. And they would come to me and tell me, we're now going to restrict you to this. I say, okay, sit down, let's have tea. And so I never got to fear anybody, not because I could physically tackle them, but spiritually, mentally, and emotionally, I was unbreakable. And that came also from loss. Loss is like fire. You either come out of it as ash or you come out of it as steel. I was fortunate to have the support of Catholic priests who really helped to keep my spirit strong at the lowest point in my life, when I really was feeling so despondent. And this is another thing which I would like to encourage young people to remember. You don't have to be religious, but you've got to have a spiritual life. Because we are spirit people. Human beings are not just the body and the mind. It's the spirit which carries the flame of life and is inextinguishable. And once that spirit is nurtured, visited, conversed with, it becomes the torch that shows you wherever you go. It doesn't mean you won't have problems. Boy, did I have problems in life. Big one, big time. But you fall and you dust up and you get up.
I got to ask you one more question, and I'm sure you know that this is a debate that many of us have had. So every now and again there's a braai or outing with friends, and your name would come up, and I would defend you from the position of, you know what, every country needs its intellectuals who stand apart from politics. That is, whose strength lies in the fact that they can speak truth to power without any fear or favor as intellectuals. So, and then there would be others that say, no. Prof Mamphela has to go into politics. You know, she has to make her ideas concrete in the form of, you know, policies and plans and so on and so forth. Was in retrospect, your entrance into party politics, you know, through Gang and then later through the alliance or attempted alliance with the DA, was that a mistake?
You know, I'm glad I did it, because if I hadn't, I would have now be sitting and say, only. You know, when you have that idealism and you see things going as wrong as they were going at the time. Remember, that was the beginning of real highway robbery style of state capture. And I could see it. And so I was like a mother throwing herself in front of a roaring dog. And I'm not saying I was the mother of the country, but I was thinking about my children and my grandchildren and the kind of country they were going to be living in. I think it was actually good for me to do that, because my whole life I had been a commentator. I had been an engager in terms of ideas. And getting into that space showed me things which have helped me to do what I'm doing now. Because I had always had the sense that people need to simply know that there are alternatives, know that there is a different way of doing politics from the politics that have been done. No, knowledge doesn't change paradigms. What changes paradigms is a shift in that psychosocial side of us, the spiritual, the heart, and then the mind follows that. And I had underestimated the extent to which South Africans were deeply wounded people. And you heard, after that whole painful experience, I came out and said that we actually have to deal with this woundedness. And this is why I founded Reimagine South Africa. Because you don't deal with woundedness by looking at the wound. You've got to look at something, reimagine a different future. Believe that you can, in fact, transcend this. And so I'm glad also I did that with Helen. As you know, Helen was very close to me when I was at the University of Cape Town. And the side of her, which was revealed by that exercise, But also now, I mean, it's worse now than then, because then I said to people after it all that I don't believe she's a racist. But now I can tell you in no uncertain terms, she is, very deeply. I mean, anybody who can say that you can't trash colonialism, it's brought some things that are good, again, is the lie that Africa was a dark country until people like her ancestors arrived here to steal our land. Now, so I think, I wish I didn't have had to do that. But the sense of disappointment with my country was such that had I not done that, I would have been sitting now and saying, perhaps I should have. But now, of course, I'm a free spirit again, and I can do what I'm doing with a very clean conscience that no one can blame me for not having tried. But the journey for South Africans to embrace who they are and to shape a future that exemplifies how Ubuntu should be lived. It's going to be a very long journey. And for that, I have to put my time and energy in young people who must lead that process.
Dr. Ramphela, I am so honored to be able to talk with you. You still inspire me and so many of us as South Africans. So thank you for the opportunity. I will now hand over to Louise, who has a bunch of very interesting questions I noticed for you. Louise?
So we're going to take them one at a time, Dr. Ramphele. And the first one, which is close to your heart and close to all of our hearts, is education. So if you were Minister of Education tomorrow, what do you think are the 3 top priorities that you think we should tackle with vigor and commitment?
The first priority is to gather people like Jonathan Jansen and all the heads of institutions, higher education, up to the lower school, because education without teachers, it ain't gonna happen. And I really believe that we have not done enough to create an environment for teachers to do the leadership work that they should do. The second thing I would do is to bring in people who have experimented with ways of addressing the most challenging problems. And do you know what the biggest constraint to education in South Africa is? Lack of self-confidence by teachers, which they then infect the children with. And of course, the fact that a lot of children live in poor circumstances, it does actually undermine your self-image. And so if you look at the Leap School model, which works in Diepsloot, Langa, all the horrible places, but they produce A's in math and science. Why? How? By simply making every child feel that they matter and that they have talent, and that what it takes is hard work, but support by peers, by teachers, by the community. And the third thing I would do, make sure that no child goes to a school without proper facilities. It's scandalous that children today still have pit toilets. And then you have the kind of teacher who hates himself so much that he can take a child and put the child in a toilet to look for his cell phone. I mean, this is the level of lack of self-respect by some of our teachers and many of the people in official positions who steal money. It's lack of self-respect. When you steal food from school feeding, what kind of human being are they? You know, when I grew up, they always say, How? A human being doesn't do that. So your humanity is defined by that respect for yourself and others. So those are the three things I would do.
Thank you. One of the things that you have done many years ago is you talked about the difference between being consumers and citizens. And it shaped a lot of what we've done in Partners Possibility over the last 10 years. So I wonder whether, for the benefit of those people who haven't heard you talk about this, whether you could just talk about that distinction, which is a really important distinction around showing up either as a consumer waiting for handouts, etc., or showing up as a citizen.
I think it goes back to what Jonathan was talking about. Where did we lose our idealism? Because to be a consumer is to lack a sense of self and ambition. And that is the problem we introduced in the country by being anti-apartheid fighters instead of liberation struggle activists. And when our first government started, it projected itself as the giver of schools, of houses, of this. And I was very close to Dr. Mandela. So I said, Dr, you're going to live to regret this. Human beings, and particularly on this continent, you are not allowed to eat unless you have contributed. But importantly, as citizens, it means you are the owner. It's like me in my house here. Suddenly, I now am waiting for Jonathan to bring this or that. It doesn't make sense. I'm the owner of this house. Citizens are the owners of South Africa, not the ANC, not the DA, not anybody. And that's the mindset that needs to shift. Because South Africans, black and white, none of us have ever lived in a democracy and understood this concept of citizenship. But look at the United States. Because of this lack of consciousness of citizenship, they can follow somebody like Trump, the Trump, because they have decided to put away their own agency as citizens. So it's very, very important for us as South Africans and as global citizens to exercise our citizenship, which is about rights and responsibilities. You can't get anything for free. No free lunch, no free supper.
Thank you. I always love listening to you. There's one great question from Jandra, and then we're going to stop there. She says, hindsight is always 20/20. With the benefit of such broad and deep experience in leadership, what would you have done differently on reflection, and what personal lessons would you like to share in this regard? And in addition, what adjustments would you have made to your leadership approach, or have you made to your leadership approach over the years? And that's the last question for today.
Well, I mean, one of the things about knowing yourself is being conscious of your strengths and weaknesses. I've made big time mistakes. I mean, just in my personal life and even in terms of the way I managed the career choices I made, I could have done them differently. But here's the thing. If you spend your life saying, oh, if only you have lost. And the reason I have succeeded to the extent that I did is that when I've made a big mistake, I sit down and say, Mamphela, you've just put your foot in it. Now get out of it. So you've got to figure out how you get out of that mess that you got yourself into. And you've got to have the humility to acknowledge that you made a mistake. And when you do that, you learn from your mistakes. I mean, even with my children, because I was brought up in a very authoritarian household with my mother, who was like an army general. So I had to learn with my sons that I can't do that. And when I lose my temper, they say, Mom, I say, I'm sorry. Then I have to go back to base. But also I do have to say, having a spiritual life is very important. to help you moderate. And when you are just about to lose it, you just have to take a deep breath and say, how interesting, you should think that way. And then let that person stew on their own.
I want to tell a very quick story around this. So when I first returned to South Africa, I met very interesting people, and one day sat in the kind of reception area at the Cape Grace Hotel, and there was a group of women from the US who came to South Africa on a study tour, and they had the opportunity to visit with Dr. Ramphele. And I felt so jealous. I thought that is so unfair that the people from the US come to South Africa and they get to meet her and we don't ever get to spend time with her. I want to say that I feel one of the things that I've been most blessed by over the last 10 years is many different conversations and interactions with Dr. Ramphele. Thank you so much again for today. I'm seeing lots of appreciation on the chat. Thank you, Professor Jansen, for making this possible. Thank you for everybody who contributed to today. It was just, as always, an amazing opportunity. And thank you, Professor Jansen, for hosting. Lots of appreciation coming through in the chat now. So with that, I want to say thank you. And we hope that you all have a wonderful evening and go out and be leaders and citizens. We are the leaders we've been waiting for. We're not going to wait any longer for anybody else to create the future we are committed to. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, Jonathan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prof.
So thank you.
Thank you.